it's a pleasure to be there, or virtually there, I guess, in pictures and voice. I have to tell you, this is the first time I've ever done a lecture in this format, and I worried about it so much I couldn't even sleep last night. So I hope it goes okay. I mean, this is a new thing, but we're into social media and we're into learning how to do new things here. So this is a really good experience, and I'm really happy to talk with all of you this afternoon. And thank you, Marianne. That was wonderful to participate in. You brought up things that I'd totally forgotten, and things that I've hadn't thought about in a long time. So that was really fun. And I should just mention that the doorknob thing, I think actually that was John Dane and I together did that, but we worked so closely during a period of time that sometimes one would start a thought and the other would finish the thought, and we didn't even have to talk about it. But anyway, what I want to do in this moment is continue maybe, or add some other context of what Marianne talked about regarding merge, but also regarding how does one become a merger? How do you get into this? And as I note here on this front page, I consider myself an applied anthropologist, and I'll talk about how my work has not stayed in any single institution, but flowing with the movement, as it will, across different places, different times. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think were the most important elements in merge in Ecuador in particular. Now, I'm not going to talk just about the Amazon, and in fact, I'll talk probably more about the highlands. And then I want to talk about our own organization, an NGO here in Ecuador, and what we've been doing to further the inclusion of gender as a strategic part of the work we do. So that's my goal, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. I want to start with a little bit of background just to let you know how does somebody get into this. And through a series of fortunate circumstances, I did my high school work in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil from 65 to 67. And this is due to my father's job with USAID. And when I returned to the United States, because I had the language background, I went to a local college in Virginia and became a Spanish literature major. And I thought that, that was going to be the best thing to do. And then I went on to spend a junior year in Madrid in Spain. And as I was moving forward in the literature, I think it was when I got to 18th century poetry that I realized that this really wasn't what I wanted to do, and that I needed a completely different focus. And fortunately, there was an opportunity to switch to Latin American studies. I did that. And in my second semester of my senior year, I found myself on the Trans-Amazon Highway studying colonist families. And this was due to Charles Wagley's influence before I even went to the University of Florida, before I knew about the University of Florida, or before I'd even met him. And the thing was, he gave what was apparently a very good and influential talk at a LASA meeting, and my major professor was there. And she came back all enthusiastic and said, I had to go to the Trans-Amazon Highway. As one of the few people in the university at that time who spoke Portuguese, that was my only credential to be able to go and do this particular piece of work. But it changed my life. And those 3 months of traveling on the highway when there really wasn't any highway, I think opened up the area that I wanted to focus on and what I wanted to be in the future, although it's gone through many iterations. And Wagley then encouraged me to apply to the University of Florida and to join the MALIS program, which was, I think, at that point in its first years. And MALIS was great because it allowed you to be interdisciplinary in a way that I think most universities have never approached. And for me, I was able to continue a focus on anthropology, which I had not studied before I went to the University of Florida, and a focus on a region, Amazonia, and a focus on tropical agriculture, which was the principal motivator for development across the Amazon and behind the Trans-Amazon Highway, which I know you have already heard a lot about and which you will hear a lot about from Marianne. But when I was a student and looking at how I was going to handle my thesis research as a MALIS student, I didn't think at that point I was going to go on to a PhD, but Wagley encouraged me and insisted that I should take courses, ag courses across campus. And he said that this was akin to studying an indigenous language prior to, hold on just a second. Okay. Prior to being able to go to the field. And he continually told me, you have to be able to speak the language of those who are proposing to develop the Amazon. And I think that was crucial to me, was to be able to understand that this was an essential part of becoming an applied anthropologist, was to truly immerse myself in the nature of tropical agriculture, but as an anthropologist. And I then continue my focus on agriculture development in the Brazilian Amazon as I did move into a PhD and did my work at the University of Florida in anthropology from 76, 79. And what sustained me was playing racquetball on the weekends and other times with Marianne and others. And as Marianne noted, I became a potato anthropologist at SIP from 79 to 83 as a postdoc. And this was, again, an excellent opportunity to move the issue of gender into other areas in dealing with geneticists and what we would consider in agriculture as very hardcore top-level scientists in the field. And it was a huge challenge, and I learned a lot about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And then I was lucky enough to return to Florida, become a farming systems anthropologist in 83 to 88. And I worked mostly, practically entirely in West Africa. And again, language was the basis. I was the only one on the team that spoke French, and so I got West Africa. And that was great because it was a completely different area, and it opened my eyes to other kinds of issues, and particularly to an entirely different system of gender and gender analysis. And I think that expanded my way of thinking, and it also disabused me of many prejudices that I had on my own ideas concerning gender. And during this period of time, I was, as Marianne mentioned, I was one of the people that helped create that early WEAD program. But my strong focus at this time was really the experimental issues in the FSSP project and how to incorporate gender into farming systems research and extension using case studies, the development of case studies based on what people were actually doing, and then using those for training. And the books that Marianne showed as a result of that. And then I finally took up residence with my husband in 1990 in Ecuador as a cassava anthropologist, and I've never left. Now, Marianne, I'm going to move on forward talking because it's a little hard for me to hear the questions from people, but if anybody has something urgent in this, I will be happy to stop. But maybe it's better to just go straight through and then take questions at the end. In Ecuador, between 1990 and 94, I was working on another farming systems project focused on cassava, but I, like many other people, was consistently and continuously drawn into the debates on natural resource conservation. The Rio conference in 92 made an impact on all of us working in Ecuador, and I truly wanted to move, to make a change. I think I'd had enough of farming systems for the moment. I wanted something different. So in 95, I made a conscious decision, not because there was necessarily a job available, but I simply wanted to do something with communities around protected areas, looking at water and water sources and courses. And so I joined FLACSO, Ecuador, the Latin American Faculty for Social Sciences, which has a base in Quito, and joined with a colleague who was there, someone I had worked with earlier in Peru a long time before. And in joining together and trying to create a program, we re-engaged with the University of Florida TCD program to create Merge. And I think Marianne pointed out the issue of having separate but equal projects where we were all able to work together. And it was important for these that each of us maintained our autonomy in these. So together with Jorge Recharte, who's now the director of the Mountain Institute in Peru, we created 2 MacArthur Foundation funded projects as a part of Merge. One was based in the Northern Highlands in Carchi and focused on watershed management, participation in water. And the other was around the Antisana Reserve in Ecuador, which embraces the Paramo Highlands and down to the Eastern Amazon cloud forest. And a third project that was in the same context within Flaxo was with the Nature Conservancy and funded by the Ford Foundation and included communities around a nearby reserve that also extended from the highlands down into the Amazon. And the important thing with that project was that we were looking at community conservation, especially in Amazon colonization areas that overlapped with Kofan territory. So it brought us into the often difficult conflict between colonists of many different shapes and varieties and those who are indigenous people with definite ideas and histories concerning their territory. Now, with that kind of background, and Marianne has already talked about what Merge was about and what I'm sure she'll be giving, you'll be getting more of this as you move through your course, but what I want to talk a little bit about is what I think are the highlights of merging in Ecuador. What were the key things that the program did that stimulated and left behind things that continue even today? The first is this conceptual framework, this conceptual approach based on key questions to guide gender considerations in environmental research and action. A couple of things I want to focus on. There were a series of conceptual frameworks to deal with gender and broader development had been created, and Marianne mentioned one, the Harvard case study book. We had done the farming systems case studies and worked on that, but this approach for working in the natural resource management or natural resource research field was so different. And I think when we started off, again, we thought it would be a simple transfer action. We thought it was going to be something that would be really, really, basic, and it wasn't. And one of the things that was interesting about creating this conceptual approach, although what Marianne showed says the publication date of '99, this was reviewed and debated and presented in multiple locations, and many, many people gave ideas and participated in its development, in the refinement of the questions or in raising issues or doubts about it. And this was the first time, these two pictures here was the first time it was presented in Quito in 1996 in the first Merge conference held in Latin America. So there were people here from Ecuador, from Peru, from the Western Amazon, and from other international organizations based in Quito. And the debate stimulated by this was unique. It was unique because the topic hadn't been approached in public extensively beforehand. So for many people, this is the first time that they heard about this. I remember some of the very, the silent moments as Marianne, who's sitting on the far side, I think she's wearing purple. You can see her at the very back there. She was laying out the basis for this, and people were silent and astounded as they heard about this approach. And it's much thought and debate and some confusion. Many of the people sitting in the audience here went on to be NGO directors, they went on to continue their own research. They became ministers of environment at different points in their careers, or they continued to take this into other areas. So this kind of a presentation, a dialogued presentation, was very impactful, was very important. The second thing that I think was important was the methodological creativity through training and interchange that occurred in Merge. And again, we had these several projects, or really four main institutions interacting with each other and coming together because we really wanted to share things. This was the second point, or the second area that I think Merge made a standing impact in Ecuador, was the methodological creativity through training and interchange. And in the picture, you can see the group of us sitting and interacting with John Dane, who was our key trainer of trainers in this process, and who helped us take our conceptual issues and put them into training formats, training tools that would help us deal with these issues in a way that was friendly, in a way that was engaging, in a way that would bring people into this without turning them off. And I still use one of the ones that John developed, which was Cuando yo era niño o niña, a process by which you go back and think about when you were a kid, what were you allowed to do, what you could do, and what you couldn't do, and how that affects the way you grow up and are able to use resources and understand, create knowledge. We developed under Merge a lot of methods, which many of us in Ecuador still use, such as the one you can see here, trying to help people connect ecosystems, aspects of ecosystems, and human systems, using string or yarn to bring your ideas together in a participatory fashion. One of the areas that I think was most important in this methodological aspect was participatory mapping. And I think Merge had an impact in Ecuador in terms of unleashing people's creativity to be able to use maps and the dialogues created in mapping in different formats. And one of our sources on this was drawing ideas from Diane Rochelot, many of her books, but in particular her gendered resource mapping in Kenya, but also in the Dominican Republic, which was very appropriate for what we were doing. And then our interactions. One of the nice things about Merge was bringing people together. So those of us who are in the different projects, we had several times over the year activities where we didn't just meet to talk, we met to do things together, to run a course together, etc. I remember that I was tremendously influenced by the large format gender resource mapping and the use of this then as a backdrop for sociodramas that was created by the group in Acre, Brazil. And you can see two examples of their maps here, which were presented at one of the Merge conferences. And then those of us in Ecuador and Peru, we tried these out and did our own maps, adding new things to them, adding cards and paper and drawings and more trees and making them detailed, having them on sheets, large white bed sheets, made it so that we could carry them around. We could fold them up and use them. We could make them have elevations. They could become 3D maps when we needed them to. And this, I have seen people using this kind of technology or this kind of methods in many other situations in Ecuador. And I always think that this was a really appropriate, it was an appropriate area to work on. Within Merge, we were continually refining collectively across the disciplines and across the Merge projects. And here you can see me taking notes while Marianne looks on, and our colleagues from Peru, Avisita Chichon, from Jorge Richardi, and others from Ecuador. This was a constant element in Merge, and I think it created among us a strong commitment to the notion and the real aspects of both interdisciplinarity, but also interinstitutional collaboration, breaking down those barriers or dealing with the institutional barriers that often keep us from doing effective work. In the bottom picture, you can see one of the planning sessions for one of the major activities that we did under Merge in Ecuador, which was an intensive training course in the university. And John Dane, together with other gender experts, not necessarily involved in natural resource conservation like Hilary Feldstein, and our collaboration directly with Lizette Waleka at that time, or Lizette Stahl as she is now, working on how to improve our approach in training.
She's with the water now.
You're losing me again?
No, I was just saying Lizette is now with the Water Institute here.
Exactly. And what was interesting was bringing all of this knowledge, all of this experience into the formal training, both in the field settings, but also in the university. And the Flaxo specialization course on gendered community conservation was taught over an 8-week period by trainers from University of Florida, from CI Peru, from Fundación Victoria Amazónica in Manaus, and from Flaxo. And Lizette and I were the coordinators for the duration of the entire course, but we had people from Western Brazil, from Colombia, from Ecuador, from many different organizations in Ecuador, and from Peru in this same course. And it created a cohort of people who then took this back into their organizations to work. And you can see we spent a lot of time learning and debating on how to use mapping. Why is mapping so important? And I often tell people it's because in farming systems, what was important was the when. calendars, when are you planting, when are you harvesting, what are the labor constraints in that. But in gender and natural resource environment work, the who is the where is the crucial part. And we need to understand where we are. Diane Rochelle talks about situated knowledge. It's important to know who has the knowledge where, and how does that interact across systems, across areas that are protected and unprotected, overlapping areas of ownership. So these were aspects that are really important in the course. Excuse me. And the third aspect was this notion of interinstitutionality or interinstitutional collaboration. And here Marianne was explaining this, just as she just explained it to you in the course, she explained it to all of us in the course in Ecuador almost 30 years ago. What I want to point out, though, is if you look at the paper on the wall, the papelógrafo that says program, you'll see this was an 8-week intensive course. It was 8 weeks, 8 hours a day. It was the most intensive thing I've ever been involved in, and I've never done anything like this again, and I hope I never do. But it was, for the people involved, it was interesting. I still am friends and colleagues with many of the folks that were in this course, and they said it was the most intensive experience they ever had, and draining, but they learned a lot. We crammed 16 master's level credit hours into the 8 weeks. It was 5 weeks of classroom work and 3 weeks of field work. One is a field trip in itself for a week around the entire protected area of Antisana. And then there were 2 weeks of working in small teams. There were 4 teams, and each one had a different aspect of resource management to look at using gender tools and creating a gender analysis of natural resource management in their sector. And then we had 1 week at the end devoted to training of trainers. And so John came and trained everybody in the group to become a better facilitator for learning. And I think adding that aspect into it was another hallmark of Merge, was we took the time and energy and care to make sure that people understood things, but also that they would be able to then replicate them, that they could then innovate methodologically. I think that was important. Well, now I'd like to talk about what are some of the outcomes from Merge. I mean, the project itself, all of these things ended, as all projects do, but there were things that continued, and I think they're important to note what happened over this period of time. One was the interaction between Merge knowledge and approaches and other gender-focused initiatives, and in particular, this was the forestry group in Ecuador. This was really, really vibrant, very active, very intense, and I believe that it led to conceptual expansion and refinement in the work that we've done. And I think that the forestry work in Ecuador has been strong in also helping to bring considerations for gender into other areas of the country, other areas of public policy. Second impact or outcome was that the whole project, having the methods, having documents that people could refer to, as Marianne mentioned, this meant that people could then begin to develop new research on environment topics and bring gender into their work. So there are studies, theses, work on water management, watersheds, protected areas, tropical forests, community conservation, indigenous resource work, fishing, coastal fishing in particular, ocean fishing, wildlife management, and in the past, a couple of studies on mining, which are now becoming really important as Ecuador begins to really focus and open up, unfortunately, to large-scale mining. Another area was the gender and environment training, the Casa Dentro workshops. These are workshops similar to what Marianne mentioned, but where an institution would say, hey, come and help my whole internal group understand gender and how we can apply it in our work. And we called these Casa Dentro. I did a number of them. Other people did them as well. And this helped move the notion of gender from being a single person working on something to being a collectivity, to being an institutional focus. And I think this was also important. There were new projects to continue Merge-initiated activities. One which was in particular importance was the WIDTech ICRW, DAI, USAID, lots of acronyms. But this project supported us to continue our gender and environment workshops in Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador, and a regional conference in 2001 and a publication. So the Merge conceptual framework, the Merge initiatives were able to be published, to be able brought to light, and continued in engaging people in Ecuador. This conference actually led to an interesting development, which was the movement of the national group, national working group on biodiversity created a specific group on gender and environment. And this ran for about 3 years with regular meetings and a forum for presenting research in progress, where students or researchers could present something they're working on, and we would all discuss it. And then as that wore down, we developed a discussion group on conceptual issues, and it was going back to the basics, back to early works on ecofeminism, on Diane Rochelot's initial work, and trying to understand how to continue to develop conceptually. And then there were new projects that started, new initiatives on new ecosystems. One in particular, which was very important, was the Gender and Paramo Ecosystem Research and Community-Based Management, supported by the University of Amsterdam, Ecoscientia, and Ecopie, supported by the Dutch government. And we were invited to handle gender training within this project. So that was important. And then in the year 2000, we created our own organization called Corporación Grupo Randy Randy, and it was 15 men and women, and all of us had some connection with Merge. What's Randy Randy? It's an Ecuadorian private nonprofit corporation created in 2000. It's legalized by the Ministry of Agriculture, not Environment, which has a whole story by itself. But we work on promoting conservation of natural resources and sustainable development. We use participatory approaches to research and planning that encourage social and gender equality. We have a specific policy statement that says that all our work has to include gender, whether we work for other people or we're working for ourselves. And we adopted the expression Randy Randy, or dando y dando, which means literally giving and giving in Quechua, because it expresses a sense of reciprocity that supports our work. Now I want to give you, I think it's 3 examples of some of the things we've done post-merge and in this period of time of 2000 to the present. And the first was a project with support from IDRC Canada, which has been a very important donor for gender and environment work in Ecuador. And we had the Tejiendo Redes entre Género y Ambiente project. And this supported students and young researchers to engage in gender and environment studies. And it was in collaboration with a similar project in Ecoscientia, also supported by IDRC. So in a way, these 2 projects, sister projects, did what Merge taught us to do, which was create interinstitutional connections to make your impact stronger, make it broader, make it more interesting. And over the life of this project and others that continued, we published 3 books, which were collections of articles, the best of what we thought was being done at the time, about gender and environment in Ecuador. The first one focusing on women and environment, the second on gender and environment across the Andes, and the third one, footprints of gender in the sea, in the park, and in the Paramo, was a collaboration with Susan Paulson. The second example is that we began to, as many people, look at climate change as a major factor in where biodiversity research, biodiversity actions, environmental actions, where we were going with this. And we were invited to create the social component of a large project funded by the MacArthur Foundation and run by the Inter-American Institute for Research on Global Change. And this was looking at the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in tropical Andes and climate-related risks, vulnerability, and creating decision-making tools. And in this project, we were asked to look at local perception of climate change. We added into this the gender aspect. That wasn't on their radar at the time, but it was certainly on ours. And we looked at gender perceptions across altitudinal transects between Colombia and Ecuador and between Peru and Bolivia. We engaged with a group of researchers from each place, and half of all of our surveys were done with women distributed by age. So we intentionally made sure that women were included in our interviews about perceptions of climate change. You can see how many were in each place in the table. I won't go into that. But, and I'm not going to talk about the results of all of it, but I'd like to say a couple of things about the Ecuador results, because this led us to other work. First of all, we didn't find any big differences between men and women in terms of perceiving climate change in these very biodiverse areas, but yes, in the interpretations of the effects. Women express in more detail the effects on health and domestic spaces, men more about agriculture, livestock, and crops. But what's important is men have more opportunities to attend courses or events on climate change, so they learn the lingo and can use that to interact, whereas women have less of the lingo learning opportunities. And then when we analyze the possibilities to access or participate in adaptation measures, the structural differences in gender weigh heavily, create prejudice, exclusion, and inequity. And women encounter greater difficulty in accessing inputs, credits, or other capitals to invest in adaptation measures. And we found this across all of our research sites. It was very interesting to us because we suspected that there would be other issues, but this was very strong. Oh, one other thing before I switch is you'll see here how we're continuing to use mapping, and now mapping climate risk, climate understanding, gendered understanding of climate in our maps, and continuing to deal with focal groups, sometimes all men, sometimes all women, sometimes bringing them together, using those basic tools of gender analysis in environment that Merge taught us. A third area is then in our environment work is looking at gendered adaptation to climate change. Studying it is one thing, but when we're trying to now talk about, okay, what do we propose in adaptation? How do we help people think what they might do to adapt? And we've had support from a couple of projects on this, and we've been able to focus this in our long-term research site in the Carchi province in the north, in the highlands, in a watershed, and supported with projects funded by by Finland and the IUCN, by the Spanish IACID, and by the Germans. I think we've been very, very lucky to be able to have good and broad donor support for these initiatives, which have been very experimental. The Carchi efforts looking at climate change adaptation are still fairly unique in Ecuador, and it's very exciting to work on this. We've been able to conduct participatory vulnerability studies on climate change, again, using many of the Merge ideas now focused on climate. Created a local climate monitoring program out of this, in which community women in particular and their families and men do daily monitoring of local weather, and they are analyzing how this changes, how it's affecting their crops now, and use this to make plans of what they're going to do next. This is really exciting. We also have experimented on dealing with other aspects of gender, bringing male colleagues in to lead gender sessions, using large format painted backdrops to talk about sensitive issues, dealing with masculinities and intrafamiliar gender-based violence as key issues that affect the way people are able to access information or deal with the activities that could lead them to adaptation or building resilience to climate change. This allowed us to update community management plans that we did a long time ago, and to help communities readjust them to climate change and add in new gender considerations, particularly dealing with understanding better masculine behavior, but also understanding new constraints and opportunities for women in the communities, and the dialogue and the power dimensions between men and women in these locations. We work with local parish governments to include climate change and gender considerations in their Planes de Desarrollo Ordenamiento Territorial, or PDOTs, which is the crucial document which allows a parish, the lowest level of local government, to access national funds for work in their parish. And so by including climate change and gender at this level, you have another base for hoping to create policy favorable for these issues. And finally, we've more recently been applying climate change understanding and vulnerability studies methodologies to irrigation associations, taking us back into water, looking at the complexities of water use and irrigation in the highlands, and being able to understand vulnerability within these groups and connect water users to water sources in terms of management. And this brings new actors into role, brings us back into talking with different kinds of people in the local area and opening new ways for men and women to dialogue and be encouraged to deal with change in their area. I'd like to finish this off by saying more recently there have been some interesting other activities, and this might be something for discussion in the future. Over this past year, I've been one of the consultants to the Latin American Rio Adapt working group to enhance the Latin American contributions, particularly contributions written in Spanish or Portuguese, to the IPCC report, which was just recently released. And I was responsible for writing the gender vulnerability section for this. This was a real challenge to me. I'd never worked on something like this. I'm not sure I'd do it again, but it was a real interesting process to interact with other people engaged in this. While my focus continues to be on the highlands and now on the coast in Ecuador, there are welcome but episodic initiatives in Amazonia. And a couple of these were, one which was remarkable was doing a training course for Waurani para biologists and para geographers who are working with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and talk to them about gender and environment. And I'll never forget being stopped and right at the very beginning, and a young man got up and he said, "Anthropologist, could you just simply explain to us what is this gay issue?" And I was totally taken aback. But it was really exciting to deal with this group of very young people about what does gender mean? What does it mean in my context, in my culture? What does it mean to them? And I'll never forget being completely windblown by this. And also, just a couple of years ago, did a study on urban consumption of bushmeat in northern Ecuador and Amazon, and looked at gender differences in terms of the perception of eating bushmeat. And again, was a new experience because it was talking about what I thought would be a very taboo subject. And I found people were more than happy to talk to me about how prohibited it is and how much they like eating bushmeat and why. That was a different sort of experience. And finally, we continue as Randy, both individually and as a group, dealing with specific invitations to help in management plans to be sure that participation, gender, social issues are included in training of park rangers. And these are short-term opportunities that allow us to innovate, but it also gives us an opportunity to bring new information back to our own areas of work. And I find that the Merge experience continues to provide a sound, conceptual, and practical foundation for what I'm doing. And thank you very much.